Freedoms, greetings, Helldivers. Ervin here, and wow, it's been over a year of Helldivers 2, hasn't it? We've had our highest highs, our lowest lows, our highest highs, and then our lowest lows, then some lower lows, and some higher highs, and anyway, now we're somewhere in the middle, I'd say. I mean, we do have that whole main Discord drama that's been blown out of proportions, but I don't think that's exactly the big deal gaming journalists are making it out to be. Overall, Helldivers 2, after its turbulent first year of development, is in the best state it's ever been in at the end of the day, if you don't count them accidentally removing several hotfixes when they nerfed the ultimatum by accident, which now causes your game to crash if you kill too many enemies. Okay, so it's almost never been in a better state than it is now. Either way, just because Helldivers 2 has grown a lot over the year, it doesn't mean they've ironed out all of the issues. Far from it, really. And a little more than a year ago now, I began this channel talking about Helldivers 2. Ever since then, this game has more or less been what my life revolved around. It quite literally became my job to understand the game at a deeper level than most would ever have a reason to care about. So, considering both my channel and Helldivers 2 have passed that 1 year mark of development, I wanted to go over what I feel are the top issues in the game, some of which have been around since day one, even. And given all the time and energy I've sunk into this game, what my thoughts are on how Arrowhead can potentially drastically improve Helldivers 2. One of the biggest issues that has plagued Helldivers 2 from the beginning is definitely a lack of content for longtime players. This was an issue with the game that became pretty apparent even as early as the first month. If you play Helldivers 2 at a high difficulty, you gain a lot of experience, and I mean a lot. For context, a Super Helldive difficulty 10 mission has 4 times the experience gained in requisition slips compared to a trivial mission. And although trivials are obviously much faster, that multiplier is being applied to a much greater base value on a difficulty 10 mission than a difficulty 1, meaning even when the maximum difficulty was 9, players adept at the game's highest difficulty leveled up and scaled extremely fast. We're talking achieving the original max level of 50 before the first major order even concluded level fast, without even pushing for it, just by playing the game on difficulty 9 for less than a week. The requisition slip system more or less functions to extend the tutorial, preventing players from overwhelming themselves with too many stratagems, more so than an actual currency system, especially when there isn't anything beyond the DSS to spend this currency on late in the game. And the cap of 50,000 is so incredibly small that even if you do have to spend them on a new stratagem or donate to the DSS, you're topped back up in less than a full operation. Out of the few progression avenues that do exist in Helldivers 2, the one that strangely lasts the longest is sample collection and module upgrading. Unfortunately, ship models are what I would call the most well made form of progression in Helldivers 2, and that is setting the bar extremely low. Don't get me wrong, some of the ship module upgrades by design are pretty well made, but the majority are very small stat upgrades that get smaller and smaller at higher levels that cost vastly more samples. This makes the module system actually feel pretty good early on in the game, as the upgrades you gain are extremely significant, while the price of those upgrades are also fair. The module system also pushes players to engage with higher difficulty content, further improving the feeling of progression. And while it might feel relatively tedious in those higher module levels, at least it takes some significant time and effort to accomplish, something the original max level and unlocking all of the stratagems certainly does not. So, what would I do about this lack of late game progression and progression for longtime players in general? On the topic of experience and leveling, I think the answer they originally came to was a good one, improving the level cap to 150 and adding additional titles. This obviously provided no gameplay benefit, but we as gamers are pretty simple creatures. You let our numbers go up, and our brains create more dopamine. I see nothing wrong with this strategy, especially because the experience total is tracked within the game even when you're at maximum level, and then retroactively applied when the cap increases. Now, here's the thing. And here's the issue. The increase to the level cap from 50 to 150 was so long ago, I imagine most players today don't even know the original cap was only 50. It's definitely time to expand to 250. Levels don't have to do anything special beyond more titles. Players just want to see their numbers go up, and this is a very low development time investment on Arrowhead's part to make happen. What can we do about requisition slips? First off, the 50K limit is a joke. We need to pump this up to 500,000 so this resource isn't getting capped after a singular operation. We also need new ways to spend rec slips. I feel a strong contender for a new slip sync would be the ability to purchase temporary fifth bonus stratagems with limited uses. This would have good use cases for both early and late game players. Early game players could use the temporary advantage to help them break into higher difficulty missions, while experienced players who already play high difficulty operations would use this extra stratagem due to their requisition slip income being high enough to sustain it. So there wouldn't be a reason to not interact with it on a regular basis from their perspective. We also know there originally was an unreleased build of the game that utilized this concept, having the players use requisition slips to actually buy charges of their stratagems for use within the game. It's fair to speculate the removal of this mechanic is what led to the currency feeling so worthless. So it makes sense that including that very same mechanic to a lesser degree would go a long way to improving its purpose in the game. If they didn't want to make a fifth stratagem slot available with this mechanic, though, another solid idea would be introducing super versions of all currently available non support stratagems, which you could purchase charges of with your requisition slips. They wouldn't even have to be game breakingly more powerful, just slightly better than their normal counterparts. Yet another good way requisition slips could feel more impactful while not giving the player too much power in the process. That might take potentially significant dev time, though, and introduce some more bugs. Instead, my last idea for requisition slips would be to add a temporarily unlockable fifth booster slot chosen by the host, paid for with requisition slips on a per operation basis that scales up with difficulty. Boosters represent a significant increase in player power, but a fifth booster would definitely not break the game either. And there are too many boosters available these days, it would definitely be nice to have that option to bring an extra, especially when at least three of the slots are basically spoken for by essentials every single operation already. Like I said, I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with the module system. I don't love it, but it's fine. The obvious improvement is simply adding the sixth module level that we know has been cooking for a while, in addition to the vehicle bay modules. Mechs are a pretty lackluster stratagem, most players would agree, outside of terminate operations. And with new vehicles being released like the FRV, I think it's about time we brought out the vehicle bay. I know Arrowhead's been cooking it up after all, adding a module upgrade for the mechs so that they could at least regain their ability to fire stratagems via stratagem launcher upgrade would go a long way. Something they were capable of doing in Helldivers 1. A whole new set of modules would go a long way towards furthering the longevity of samples. The sixth level of module upgrades is also certainly in development as well by now, and probably coming with a new tier of sample when difficulty 11 releases. If I'm right about this assessment, that's absolutely perfect as far as I'm concerned when it comes to implementation. I don't know for a fact this is what's going on, but I think it's a pretty safe bet. I'd also like to see a new system implemented utilizing samples as the main currency, something many of you have been asking for in the comments in my videos, and I think you are totally in the right to want a bestiary that provides some insight into our enemies somewhere on the ship that would then provide Helldivers with important information regarding our foes, like where their weaknesses are or their breakable components. When I see this idea brought up, though, some players believe this wouldn't be a good idea because discovering this kind of information yourself is part of the experience, and making it openly available could dilute that experience. That's why entries in the bestiary should be unlocked by spending samples. The weaker enemy entries unlocked with common samples, medium enemies with rare samples, and heavy units unlocked with super samples. Add a level requirement of, say, 50 for good measure, and you ensure the player base will have likely experienced the game before having the more thorough information provided through the bestiary. Especially because it would be conflicting with unlocking your modules, an upgrade path that obviously takes precedence over unlocking the bestiary. A bestiary with basic information in regards to our enemies would also put good, sought after basic information in the hands of the players without having to necessarily check the wiki for absolutely everything. You've probably noticed I haven't mentioned war bonds whatsoever. That's because I actually think war bonds as a progression system are perfectly fine. What isn't fine is how super credit acquisition is currently handled. In fact, it's probably the aspect of Helldivers I take the greatest degree of issue with by far. Super credits in Helldivers 2 are gained in one of two ways. You either pay real money for them or you loot them from points of interest in the game. This is a pretty fair system, but there is one very serious flaw I feel contributes greatly to the feeling of a lack of progression, at least for me. Super credit piles come in two sizes. You either get 10 or very, very rarely 100 from a pile. This is the same on all difficulty rankings. This makes the best way to actually farm credits, obviously, to spam trivial missions with loadouts designed to traverse the map quickly, then abandon the mission. This is horrible for several reasons. It's extremely tedious, almost to an intentional degree, as it's a common business practice when dealing with premium currencies in video games to make the best process of obtaining the currency from within the game itself incredibly tedious to promote sales. You make something tedious enough, and players will start to see their dollars as less valuable than hours of tedium. This is currently how super credits are being managed. To make matters worse, this promotes the idea of creating super credit farm parties that deploy to planets for trivial missions that never get completed, which has a negative impact on the Galactic War effort. I've explained this in a few videos by now, but basically every completed or incomplete mission performed by our Helldivers lowers the global modifier for the liberation rate. This is how the game keeps our rates from getting out of control when there are hundreds of thousands of players, but also keeps things going whenever the population gets low through the night. This means uncompleted missions and trivial level missions for super credits are indirectly reducing our galactic war progress by damaging that global modifier, which then lowers the liberation gained by Helldivers actually attempting to fulfill the major order. And this isn't an uncommon practice. I'm sure thousands of these missions are played on a daily basis, and even tens of thousands when war bonds are releasing. This isn't these players' fault, though. This is the result of a flawed system. Super credits should absolutely be more easily farmed at higher difficulties than lower difficulties. By having a significantly higher super credit per hour attached to minimum difficulty and effort, this actively decentivizes players playing harder missions, especially when you consider that super credit requirements and war bonds last the longest out of all progression avenues in the game from the perspective of a new player. When a new warbond releases, players should not be being incentivized to farm for it by running around an empty map opening crates. This is just bad design, and there's no sugarcoating that, especially when high difficulty missions take far longer, more effort, and even have less super credit spawns due to the loot pool being muddied with rare samples. So how would I fix this? The heads and eggs retrieved in difficulty 10 missions are next to worthless, only providing a couple samples when Pilestead first proclaimed they would result in huge rewards. Wouldn't it make sense to instead have these optional objectives grant 10 super credits? That would still be 100 difficulty 10 missions in which you retrieve the optional objective to pay for a war bond in its own, which does not seem to me like it would be overkill. And while it wouldn't on its own raise the credits per hour to a competitive level with Trivial, it would at least make the higher difficulties of play more rewarding for longtime players who otherwise are getting nothing but super credits out of their missions anymore, having capped all other currencies and progression methods. Besides that, I'd remove the rare sample from the point of interest loot pool on difficulty 7 and above because it's incredibly troll, and add 1 super credit to the 10 stack per difficulty rating above 1, further making higher difficulty missions more competitive with trivial spam. Now, this would obviously increase the number of super credits being produced, which could reduce Arrowhead's bottom line, and I'm not out to do that. It's just a great excuse then to add new ways to spend those super credits. I cannot for the life of me understand why Arrowhead has not yet tapped the gold mine that is adding chromas for existing armors to the superstore. Adding an armor color system like this is incredibly basic and been commonplace in the industry for what I want to say is at least 15 years. A basic texture swap system would absolutely not take much in the way of dev time. It would make the players happy because we'd have more ways to customize the look of our Helldivers, and Arrowhead would even be making more money from those unwilling to farm super credits, even with the improvements made to their acquisition. Everybody wins, and we get to collect color palettes for every armor in the game as a new avenue of pseudo progression. I touched on this when talking about the super credits, but the Galactic War is an absolute mess. Major orders on average require at least 50% of the player base to participate and coordinate in order to be successful. And this is in no small part because of how that other 50% who isn't participating is not only not accomplishing anything due to how much percentage is required to actually move the needle forward on planets that are out of the scope of the MO, it's the same situation as supercredit farming. They are reducing the global average liberation modifier, which then actively reduces the liberation rate of those actually attempting to perform the MO every time they play an operation. This absolutely sucks and promotes a very toxic work environment when it comes to discussing the Galactic War all over the internet. So, how do we fix the Galactic War? First and foremost, we need to reduce the amount of impact Helldivers playing on non major order related planets have on the global modifier compared to those that are. It's horrible knowing that those actively defying the major order are actually reducing your own efforts to follow the order. The term fundamental flaw comes to mind here yet again. Another solid improvement to the system would be to stop rewarding the 50 medals to all Helldivers, regardless of participating in the major order. Players should absolutely need to participate in the winning major order to profit from those medals. I would reward 10 medals per operation played during the major order, assuming it's successful, up to a cap of that 50 medals, and grant 10 super credits after the fifth operation. This would incentivize and reward players for participating in the major order, as well as give the player an additional reward with no maximum cap for doing so. Major order rewards should absolutely not be given for free without active participation in the major order itself. Currently, this is a very silly way of doing things that makes no logical sense, as you can't even call it a participation award, it's closer to a login bonus. We also need the ability to communicate server wide in game in some capacity. Currently, it's incredibly difficult to spread the word on how to best handle the major order. I've organized my Discord to distribute regular updates on the best moves within the Galactic War. I push that directive onto my YouTube community posts and even make YouTube videos on it occasionally. But a simple in game chat system would make it so much easier to communicate and coordinate our forces. Maybe 30% of the player base even watches YouTube to see updates on the Galactic War from me, while an in game chat would be seen by more than double that, allowing for far easier coordination. And considering how much more complicated our major orders are getting lately ever since the introduction of the Illuminate, as well as how they're only ever going to be getting even more complicated in the future, something desperately needs to change here, as the current systems are absolutely whittling down the player base's morale and interest in the Galactic War. Next on the list, let's talk just a bit about game balance. I actually think the game balance as a whole is pretty good right now. There are obviously some weapons that are struggling, namely ballistic assault rifles, the slugger, and the plasma accelerator, just to name some obvious ones. But generally, ever since the 60-day plan, things have been pretty alright, so I'll keep this section pretty short. Buff the underperforming automatic rifles, justice for slugger, justice for plasma accelerator, fix the bug with the purifier's fire rate because that weapon has been completely ridiculous for a bit too long now, and make the mechs tankier against the automatons as their current durability against automaton weaponry is a complete joke and not even remotely okay. They work just fine for Terminids, but do they really need to be so aggressively terrible against automatons? I think not. At this point, I really want to talk about clarity of in game information. I recently released a 27-minute long video going over all of the important numerical values that you cannot find anywhere within the game. Or at the very least, you're not going to be able to find what these numbers do within the game. Some of this information is very complicated, and I can understand it not being actually available within the game itself. And some stuff should absolutely be left to just on the wiki. But some stats like durable damage, demolition force, and staggering force should absolutely be visible in the game itself, listed on the stratagems and weaponry, as well as have an entry within the Bestiary console explaining to the player what they are. These are all extremely important stats to be aware of, but I have gotten a few comments on this topic saying discovering these things is part of the experience. But adding these numbers and explanations into the game wouldn't deprive you of that experience. It would simply cut back on the frustration potential experienced by those who have no clue these things even exist, because the explanations and values only exist on third party sources and sites, or rarely briefly mentioned in the patch notes. Not to mention, for those of us who do know these things exist, why is it, quote, part of the experience for me to have to remember that the 500 kg ultimatum, orbital laser, gas strike, direct impact all have 50 demolition force, while the airstrike only has 40? Wouldn't it be better to just have those numbers written somewhere in the game, as I'll still have to find out for myself what does or doesn't destroy X building through experimentation regardless? But I'll at least not have to remember as much random nonsense, which actually would make the game more casual friendly by adding this additional number, not less due to overcomplication of the UI. There's obviously more, but these are the topics I feel strongest about, and I don't want to make the video too long to the point very few people actually make it this far. So, on a final note, as far as changes I'd make to Helldivers 2, I'd have invited me to the birthday party. I mean, what the hell, guys? Apparently, I'm being sworn in at a later time, but I will remember that, and you have dropped my companion rating with the decision, Arrowhead. Luckily, I am open to receiving a custom Trailblazer Scout Chroma as penance. Jokes aside, that's going to do it for this video. I think Helldivers 2 is doing great right now, more or less, especially when you consider how big of a dumpster fire the average live service release ends up compared to the epic story that's unfolded around this game. But even if I love the game, like all things, it's flawed. I'm hoping by shining a light on its biggest flaws, maybe we see more of a push to resolve the game's deepest issues. But what would you like to see changed about Helldivers 2? Let's have a constructive discussion about it in the comments below. Thank you to my coffee supporters who help keep the channel going, and thank you for watching till the end. I'll see you next time. Hmm. Oh, I mean, I'm just that good.